I thought I'd do a short video covering a game review of one of my games just to go through some advice and maybe offer some advice about how to use an engine correctly for analysis. And I got the basis of what I'm about to talk about from international master Andras Toth, who, in combination with what he's said on his YouTube channel and in his courses that he's done for Chessable, both of which I bought so far, he really outlines how to go about using an engine for analysis. And what he suggests is that the first thing you do, and I made this mistake in my own analysis as well, is when you complete a game, the temptation is to turn on the engine right away and look for mistakes. And his point was that often when you do that, you're not really learning anything because the computer will identify where you made a mistake. But if you don't have the benefit of a coach with you or someone who's a better player with you to to help guide you through that and get you to an understanding of why you made that mistake, you're not going to really learn anything from the computer. And so what he recommends is you first review your game without the benefit of engine analysis and try to identify where in the game you made mistakes. And to help with trying to get to that next level, currently right now I'm focusing on a theme of one of his Chessable courses, which is center control. And so the idea there is because I didn't have that really as a very focused theme in my game prior to learning from his course, I can now go back and look at some recent games and start thinking about the center of the board and how I might have played moves differently. So there's a move at the end that really bothered me about this game, and I'll get to that. But there are three key junctures that I want to talk about in this game. So I've already done the step of reviewing it without an engine. I've thought about the ideas of where I might have gone wrong. So now let's go through how I would analyze it. So I think in the opening it makes sense to turn on something like Livebook, or if you have some other kind of opening database, because unless one of the two players goes wildly out of opening book theory, an engine isn't going to be so useful in the very early moves, assuming that both sides are playing moves that are, let's say, valid in some kind of opening construct. So what I do is I open with I'm using the English opening lately because I'm going for positional type game. I've always felt that in my development, I've had to work very hard at tactics because I don't think it's something that comes very naturally to me. So I've gone with a choice of opening lines to try to emphasize the positional side of the game in the hopes that I can outplay the opponent from a positional standpoint. And so just using the opening database here, we see that Black already has chosen a very inferior move on his first move with d6. So that's like not common opening book theory. So what I'm going to do is I'm playing in general the fianchetto system with g3 and bishop to g2. And so I'm just going to continue the development. So what I'm doing right here is I'm going back and looking at this game with a critical eye and saying where where are some possibilities in the opening where I could have controlled the center better than I have. So right here, we do NSC3. Um, and what you'll see with Black in this game, and the reason this game was interesting for me is when I played it, this is from Lee Chess, by the way, so 1837, just played about a week ago, 1837, my opponent is 1948. So this is very instructive. So we go back to the database, I go into the fianchetto system, E5. So this, you have to think about the threat because one of the mistakes that I've noted from previous games in the English is I haven't been taking advantage of the D and E pawns to really get some space advantage in the center and really control what I'm doing. So with this move, with Black playing E5, we have to think about what happens if he pushes to E4. And in this case, the knight would just simply come to G5 and then be able to recapture. So we don't worry about this as a threat for now. So I continue with my fianchetto. C6. Now this is where you really should start to think about the center and forgetting the opening database, which I know is sitting on the screen right there, but this is part of your game review. What would be the optimum move in this scenario if we're going to think about dominance in the center? So, and what I've been finding is that often the answer to that question will help you come up with a top line move. So thankfully in this game I did play the top line move, even though, as you can imagine, with a player at my level, it remembering and understanding opening theory is a challenge, but it's becoming easier because of the fact that I am thinking about the center, and often I'm finding that I can correct mistakes from previous games. And when I start to think about concentrating on the center, I can come up with a better move that often shows up at the top of the database. So in this case, thankfully, I played d4, again, not worrying about the push of to e4. And of course, with recapture, we're just simply going to recapture with the knight, again exhibiting great control over the center, and then having the bishop on g2, having control over the white squares in the middle. So again, you see a move here that does show up in the database only with 9 games, and it's very slow. And this is a theme of Black's play. So Black is not aggressively developing, not really worrying about the center of the board, although queen to c7 is not terrible from the perspective that it controls d6 and controls e5. But again, we want to get the king to safety. So right now, if I go back and look at this game with the idea of center, e4 could be a possibility, but we're not really in a position yet to really. I would like to have more protection over the e4 square before I do that. So in this case, I opt for king safety with castle, and I'm happy to find that as the top line move in the database. So then he plays bd7 again, very compressed pawn structure, not taking advantage of space in the center. So this is just absolutely screaming for us to really push into the center aggressively and punish Black for being so conservative in the opening. So at this point, now that we're at move 8, what we'll do is we'll go and turn on the engine and then start to see what its advice is with regards to how we might have played this, because we're starting to sort of semi get out of the opening book, and where one of the two of us might have made a mistake, and so we really should look for a review. So in this game, what I've been doing prior to this game is in this English system that I'm playing is being kettling on both sides. So often I would continue with b3 and just simply bishop to b2 with the idea of controlling the center. But in this case, once I finished the course on center control, I started to reevaluate this. And right away, if I were to play this game again, I would have immediately pushed e4 to punish Black for not taking space in the center and not really playing the opening correctly. So b3 is too conservative, and although it has the hyper-modern approach of getting the bishop to b2 and then covering the dark squares, if I were to play this game again, I would do e4. And lo and behold, it shows up as the top line move in the database and also with the engine analysis as well. So we didn't do that. I did b3. So that's a learning moment here. And here he goes completely out of book. So we can go back to the notation, and there are some notes in there that came from the Lichess system with regards to their engine analysis. But I'm running this on a decent machine, so I'd rather look at Fat Fritz to see what its analysis is rather than what the Lichess engine is recommending, even though for both they should be somewhat similar, right? So at this moment, Black plays an extremely slow move in h6. But it has some validity in that we need to think about where our last remaining piece is going to develop. And he seems like he was trying to avoid my bishop to g5. But to me, it's a bit of a strange decision because I was intending to go to b2 anyway. So he wasn't really preventing anything that I was thinking of doing. Black opts for castling. And again, we thinking about our last pieces, so we want to connect these rooks, get them into the center, and control central squares. So what's a logical move? And remembering that I wanted to have extra pressure on c2, so queen to c2, and I'm happy to see that the engine liked that. R to e8, sensible move. He certainly wants to have the rooks in the middle, this controls the e-file. This pawn could potentially be a little weak right now, as it's a little bit backwards. So I have a couple options here. I could get my rooks into the center, so RA to D1 or RF to E1, but I'd like to prevent this pawn push now that this pawn has come to here. So I take advantage and play E4. So I was very happy with the way I played this opening. Now he starts to really sort of come unglued. Knight to f8. So when pieces are going backwards, that's never a good sign. That's sort of one of the chess axioms that we can think of. So we already know that black is not playing this correctly. And so now that we have the opportunity just to continue our control in the center, continue our development, what are the strong moves? So the ones I mentioned previously come to mind immediately. The rook should just get to the center. We've got great central control here. So our A to D1 comes to mind right away. Our F to E1 comes to mind right away. In this case, unfortunately, I played H3. And the computer doesn't hate it, but it really, I sort of did the same thing he did here with my bishop. I'm realizing in this game that he doesn't really have a good square for his bishop to go to. E6 might come under some pressure if I push D5. So I want to prevent this pin, so I just sort of played H3. But if I had to play this game over again, I wouldn't do that. I would have moved one of my rooks to the center. So H3. N2 G6. So he's clearly trying to direct these bishops, and maybe potentially the queen as well, towards the king side. So at this point, I played RA to D1, which again is the top line move by the engine, so that's good to see. Bishop to D7. And here's where I play a real howler, like an absolutely horrendous move. So I talked in previous videos about the knights being on the optimum position here. And so you never want to move a knight away from central control unless there's a really, really sound reason. We've already played H3 to prevent the pin on G4. There's no way that knight should be moving. We need it to control D4. We need it to attack E5. And instead, what I played was knight to H2 because I began to get nervous about the pressure on this file. So that's the first key moment of the game. But aside from the potential tactics that are coming down into here, which frankly isn't much of an attack right now, given that we have this good pawn cover right here, although we do need to be careful. If I had to redo this, thinking about central control, what would I have done instead? Well, an obvious move that comes to mind is the rook on, given it's the last piece that needs to be developed, the rook on F to E1. But what the engine's pointing out is that, and this is quite common, when we've done a good job of taking over the space and aggressively going into the center, black is playing a little too conservatively and it hasn't really pushed his pawns in the correct way. Obviously, these are going to start to interact in the middle. And unfortunately, there's no way around this. We have to be able to have the vision and the calculation to look for what should have happened. So these potential pawn interactions in the middle, I should have paid more attention to, because what the engine points out that I missed is C5. And it's a strange move to see, especially after B to D7, because B to D7 hasn't really changed the character of this. But the engine's point is that if D were to recapture, we're going to target this. So we're just going to simply take on E5, with the idea that, remembering that this bishop is protected by the queen and it's going to cover the square. So there's no way the queen can recapture. So if the knight recaptures, then we're just simply going to recapture ourselves. And if black makes a mistake of recapturing there, we have the tactical shot N to D5, hitting the queen with the bishop. Queen can, of course, recapture given the pawn here. And so that was simply tactical vision and chess vision overall that I didn't have on that move, and I should have been able to see. So when the pawns begin to interact in the center, we need to pay more attention to what we're doing. So NH2, absolutely terrible move. I would never have played that now that I've studied the center more. So now, of course, he's threatening H3. I decided to get out of this by playing H4, which the engine did have as the top line move, but you can see my evaluation starting to fall. The engine's judging this as close to even at this point. So he comes in with B to H3. And here's another really key moment. So I don't need to panic about the capture on this bishop on G2. So what I really should have done is developed my rook. So instead, I don't do that, but I played N to E2. And again, much like I mentioned about the knight on F3, when this is controlling such good squares in the center, you'd really have to have a strong reason to move it. My thought was to get it to the king side to help in the defense of the structure here, because it is getting a little scary. But as Andras Toth has pointed out, scary is not evaluation. You have to calculate it through, and you have to determine whether black's threat is real, because often optically it looks like there's something quite serious happening when there isn't. And so again, it would have taken you would need a very, very good reason to move the knight from c3 to here, which of course is going slightly backwards. It does of course release the bishop's influence over the dark squares, which is of course good. So that was one plus of the move. But if I were to play this game again, I would not have made either of those knight moves, now that I'm thinking more about central control. So he plays into h5, and I play into f3, which is a mistake. So again, the engine's pointing out, just ignore this. We have pawn protection, we have the knight covering here. Just get the rook going. We're not going to play f4. We're not going to try to break the center this way with all the potential threats and movement that he has with the minor pieces here. So if I'm not going to play f4, why wouldn't we just do rf to e1? And that's what you find in studying with the engine with regards to central control. Once you start thinking about central control, what you'll find when you review your games is that the engine moves make a lot more sense when you go to review, because often, much like this move, the engine is simply saying, focus on the center, get more influence over the center. So that's a great opportunity. And then the rest of this game basically broke down. So he played bishop takes f4, and it made some mistakes. There was nh4, and it just led to tactical complications that I misplayed. I tried to take there, and then what was needed here was r to d3, which I did find, but then r to g6, and then the natural inclination would be to cover this. And defensive technique is something that we'll focus on a lot in this channel, but because the computer is ability to help us with defensive resources, which is something I got from Boris Gelfand's book, is really substantial. And so I got this wrong. This is one of the major weaknesses in my game right now, is defensive resources. It's a little hard to see. The natural move is, most people would say, sure, just play knight to g3. But in this case, it's actually best to play the rook, which is captured by the knight. But in any case, we're losing this game, or certainly at a disadvantage. And although it's not completely lost, and I could have saved the game by continuing to play, because of course the rook can't really recapture, because on this and recapture with the queen, we just slide over with the queen, blocking on g2. So that's that game. Some key features on center control, and looking for the tactical vision in the center